All right. Can you hear me well? Cool. Good morning, everyone. Thanks a lot for coming. Before we begin, in case you wonder who we are, the keynote, oh, right. Nathan Ferguson with me is a front-end lead, and I'm a senior designer. And we both work together in the themes team in the Montreal office. So our team is basically responsible for creating new Shopify themes. And I have to say we are very excited that we got to travel all the way from Canada to be here with you today in such a beautiful venue. This is great. And we're going to be talking about designing for small screens, the design, layout, and implementation details that all make the UX. The goal today is to dive deep on a couple of points we both find key to building themes for mobile.
Before we start, it's like to get a lay of the land. So in this graph here, we can see online store sessions across our platform for the past 2 years. And it's very apparent that mobile browsing has been in the majority over desktop, but also that number has been steadily increasing over the last 24 months. Desktop and laptop browsing, by comparison, have been steadily decreasing. And if we zoom in on the last 6 months specifically, we can see that mobile browsing accounts for just under 70%, desktop or laptop under 30%, and tablet only making up around 6%. And for clarity, this is capturing global usage. This is all customer sessions on our platform across this time. And when we look at the 5 most popular browsers used by our merchants' customers, it's probably not a surprise that 2 of them are browsers native to devices, to mobile devices. That's Mobile Safari and Chrome for mobile. And the other 2 are web views that are being rendered in Facebook and Instagram. And again, for clarity, this is talking about online storefront sessions, not checkout. And in checkout, there's this kind of conventional wisdom around it that people will browse on their phone, but wait till they go home for their personal computer to actually buy things. And this wisdom is now more of like a myth when I look at the actual checkout data, because it is true that Edge and Internet Explorer and Firefox start climbing higher in the ranks for checkout, but the most popular browser at checkout remains Mobile Safari by a significant percentage. And so it's arguably more important to focus on the mobile experience than the desktop experience, but then when you think, that immediately raises this question is, how do I take my website content with its various layouts and its different interactions and its unique UX, and translate all that content to something 1/24th the screen size? And when we start thinking about that, we very quickly encounter what we refer to as the realities of mobile. And the first and the most apparent of which is screen size. We just have fewer pixels to work with on our phones in comparison to our laptops and our desktop monitors. Also, we're dealing with different inputs from the user. We don't have a trackpad and a mouse, so that means we can't rely on hover, but we do have access to new types of inputs, like gestures, which are like pinch to zoom, and swiping in multiple directions. And finally, we have this reality that we all have to accept, is that we all have very fat fingers. And this has nothing to do with our metabolism, but just the fact that our fingers are less precise than a cursor, so by comparison, links and buttons are going to be harder to use. And when links and buttons get hard to use, when they're too small for the screen, too small for the user, they risk accidentally pushing on the wrong thing, which is a frustrating experience and not the user experience we're going for, obviously. So how do we tackle this first problem? Well, if we take a page from Google, specifically material design, they recommend a touch target size of 48 by 48 pixels, so that a 10mm finger pad could easily use it. So for visual reference, in preparation for this presentation, I measured my own finger, and what this recommendation comes down to, that pink circle, so it's about the size of my fingernail. And this 48 by 48 is only talking about the touch target size, the surface area. That doesn't mean all our buttons and our icons now suddenly need to be that big. Again, this is from material design. That magnifying glass is only 24 pixels wide, but that whole surface area is meeting their recommendation. All right, so that's cool for Google. So what have we done in Shopify? This is a screenshot of the narrative theme, which was designed by Guillaume and launched earlier this year. And if we look at this header bar, for example, we can see that these icons are much smaller than 48 by 48. But if you were to press anywhere in this surface area, it's going to trigger that menu button, and it's going to trigger that link for the cart. And that's not to say that we always do it perfectly. This is a screenshot from Brooklyn. It was designed and developed 2 years ago, and it remains a very popular theme in our theme store. But what's going on here is what happens when you take a direct translation from the desktop to the mobile experience. If I were to use this in my hand and use my thumb to interact with the cart, my thumb, I measured, is 16 millimeters wide. And so when I try to interact with that number input, change that 1 to a 7, this is what it looks like temporarily. And I have a high risk of pressing that minus button, which is going to clear the cart in this case, not what I'm going for. So going back to our original question, and I should say that this theme is actually the Testament theme made by a Shopify partner at Maestro Themes in Paris. So I find a really beautiful theme. But going back to the original question is, how do we take all that content and translate it to mobile? And the short answer is you don't. A well-designed website is going to use different layouts that are more appropriate for different screen sizes, and it's going to leverage different gestures and different interactions that are more appropriate for that. And I know that in web development there's this concept of mobile first, but that is actually not a mindset that Guillaume or I or the themes team subscribe to. Whether it's mobile first or mobile second, the reality is you're going to be designing unique experiences for different screen sizes and different contexts. And what we're going to keep revisiting over and over again, it's the context that's going to decide what's most appropriate.
So every time we create a new theme, we want to identify gaps or areas where Shopify could do better. And we also really want to make sure we provide merchants with free themes that are different from each other, designed with different patterns to cover a wide range of merchants' needs in terms of features, but also in terms of UX and aesthetic. And currently, we are working on this new theme called Flagship. It's tailored for large inventory stores. And early in the project, the mobile version of the cart page felt like a good area to dig into, and I think it makes a perfect case study to give you more context on what we do in the themes team, how we are approaching mobile, and why some design decisions are made. But why should we care about the cart page in the first place? Of course, not all abandoned carts can be blamed on UX issues, but if your cart page does have some UX issues, merchants could be losing a big chunk of their revenue per year. And before working on a new design, we make a research, and we like to focus on 3 main aspects, which are convenience, intuition, and aesthetic. So a high convenience rate means the user can accomplish their tasks easily with few clicks, less scrolling, and less friction points. And there's always a learning curve when a user enters a website for the first time, but keeping that learning curve low makes a website more intuitive, and aesthetic is when the design is visually appealing. For us, it also has to provide something different. And based on those criteria, here are some findings about our current free themes. So having every interaction at hand and having the checkout button easy to reach often results in small and tightly packed buttons. In those 2 examples, the checkout button is sticky, which can be very convenient, but it also reduces the space even more. So the aesthetic is compromised, and like we've seen earlier, the minimum tap target is not respected. So to avoid that, it's tempting to add more white space and to increase the size of the buttons and images. So it may seem more successful from the aesthetic angle, but we could also argue that now we have a longer scroll that pushes the checkout button further down, and it makes it harder to get an efficient overview of the full order. And some other themes seems to have just the right balance between button size and aesthetic, but if I look closely at Debut, there is an interaction cost because all the actions are hidden under the edit button, and on Jumpstart, there is simply no featured thumbnail, which leaves more room for the rest. And I'm not saying those examples are all bad. Some layouts may be more successful than others, but they all have their strengths and weaknesses. And designing for small screens can be very challenging. There is no one-size-fits-all UX solution we can stick to and apply everywhere. But we can certainly focus on some of those pain points and see how we can reduce friction for the customer. So with Flagship, large thumbnails and large UI elements were absolutely not going to be left aside. But the question remains, how do we squeeze everything in a small screen? We decided that Flagship cart would be a different cart. And one important goal for us here was to go back to square one and try to leverage the touchscreen capabilities to solve that puzzle. So we had one design we were fairly happy with. The grid is convenient, the thumbnails are big, the buttons are easy to interact with, but on the intuition level, it was not satisfying. In order to provide large images, the grid relies on an horizontal swipe concept. So you swipe right to view the full image, and you can swipe left to be able to remove products from your cart in one easy tap. And because it's an unusual pattern, there is a learning curve for the customer, and we had to find a way to flatten that curve as much as possible, because the last thing we want is to add more friction by trying to reduce it, obviously. So an entrance animation was added. You can see it right here. And it's subtle, but it helps emphasis a little bit more on the horizontal swipe interaction and on the fact that more content lives outside the viewport. But then we realize not all images may look good when they're cropped in the center. And after all, we have no control on what type of images will be used by merchants. So we tried something different without cropping. But then the swiping interaction seemed less discoverable. And the default size of the images can be very small if they're using a landscape ratio. So we went back with the cropping behavior, but with centered content instead. And we decided to go with that version. And there is a trade-off when we try to design things differently. It's often about being intuitive, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't try to explore unusual patterns. And it could be a little bit arbitrary to decide if a UX is satisfying or if it's actually solving problems, but user testing will always inform that decision. And still, in the end, we decided to try another prototype, a complete different version. There is more focus on the subtotal and on the checkout button. And the images are big, but we felt like the layout was less convenient. And the overview is more difficult to grasp. So from the beginning, the main problem with the cart page has been discoverability. And where do you draw the line to decide if a learning curve is acceptable or not? Gestures have the same problem as icons do. There are common ones that most users understand, like tapping, zooming, and scrolling. And there are those that need to be discovered and learned. And it's easier when you're an app like Tinder, but on a website, if you hide an option, less people will use it. And a user interface shouldn't have to be explained. So with Flagship, 4 factors helped us draw this line. So cropping and animation are hints, but viewing the full image is not a crucial feature. And being able to remove products from your cart in one tap is nice, but there are 2 other ways to remove products from your cart. As you will see later, the horizontal scrolling is a repeated pattern users may learn earlier in the website. And at the end, what's my note? Yeah, the discoverability trade-off allows a more mobile-friendly layout that really maximizes the limited screen estate.
So when we start designing a full website for small screens, one of the things that jumps to mind is navigation, and we're going to spend some time diving deep into navigation. And the reason it's so top of mind is because it comes down to the simple concept that if customers can't find a product, then they can't buy it. And this might not be a great revelation, but the Baymar Institute did write a whole report about it, and I used a quote from it, so now it's real. But when we look at navigation, it comes in a number of forms, and one of them is filtering. And so filtering, which we're seeing here with the Empire theme, is very common with stores that have large inventories, where the merchant has classified their products by predefined categories as suggesting for users. But another form of navigation is search. Some people don't want to use filters or the menus, and they want to jump straight to the search to look for products based on their own language and not the language of the merchant. And finally, there's menu systems. Probably the thing most of us think of when we hear the word navigation. And when we look at menu systems, they come in a lot of forms. There's accordions, there's flyout menus, there's sequential menus, there's entire screen takeovers. And this raises this question of why are there so many different menu types? And the short answer is because there's no one best menu type. The context determines what's best, and try to explore, like, well, what's an example of a best menu based on the context? We're going to use narrative versus debut, 2 free Shopify themes, as a case study. And this is something Guillaume's talked about a couple times already, but we're going to keep referring to this idea of minimum interaction costs, that a user should get to the element of interest with as little effort as possible. This means as few taps, as little scrolling, and 0 page reloads if you can do it. And another aspect of interaction costs is cognitive load. It should not be difficult to understand what you can do and what's possible. So the narrative theme is designed for small inventories, maybe a single product or a small collection, and it's using an accordion menu, which means that all the menus expand and collapse. And this is a Shopify merchant called Crazy Horse Craft that's using the narrative theme. So it's using an accordion menu style, and there are right ways and wrong ways to use that, and one of the ways, the more correct way, is the idea of having few submenu items, and the Nielsen-Norman group suggests, based on their research, that it's less than 6. So when we look at accordion menus for short lists, kind of across the board, we're huge fans of this menu style. We find it's convenient. If you are following the recommendations of small menu items, only 6 or less, there's not very much scrolling. You can keep the parent category in view. It's intuitive because it's a common pattern on the internet, and also the drop-down arrow, there's usually some visual cue to explain what to do, and we think it's pretty easy to make an accordion menu look nice. But that's accordion menus for short lists. If I took the exact same menu style and my context was having frames, repair kits, handles, wheels, helmets, lights, women's apparel, men's apparel, company, under wheels, I had spokes, patches, rims, mountain tour, racing, travel packs, tubes, kids and family, pets, all of a sudden, that accordion style looks more like this. It's not convenient anymore because now what happens is you end up pushing the parent category out of view, and yes, you have long scroll, but you're losing context about what the subcategory is. It's still just as intuitive as it was before. We haven't changed anything with the interaction type, but now Guillaume and I feel it's starting to look a bit ugly. So accordion menus are great for themes and stores that have small categories, a small catalog, but debut theme, for example, which is the starter theme, and because it's a starter theme, it has to appeal to a wider audience, it uses a sequential menu style, which means that the submenus are shown in independent steps. This is pretty common for mobile applications. If you open up your iPhone and you go through settings, it's usually a sequential menu style. And sequential menu styles aren't necessarily a better menu system, they're just different, and because it's this, they have trade-offs. And one is this idea of nested null navigation that just gets, the deeper and deeper you become nested, the more confusing it is where you are, and it's easy to lose track of. There's also documented confusion around the back button. So if you saw on the previous slide, to move back a step, there's a back arrow, a chevron. And there's documented confusion between the browser's native back button and also the back button on your actual device. And as soon as you accidentally click the wrong back button, you're triggering a page refresh and you've shot up the interaction cost. And finally, there's that trade-off with sequential menus about spatial awareness, that people who have low spatial ability have more trouble with this type of menu style. And spatial ability relies on our working spatial memory. That's our ability to accomplish tasks and remember things long enough to complete those tasks. So an example being, if you were to navigate how to get to the room today by looking at a floor map, remembering what that floor map looked like to navigate the hall, that relies on your working spatial memory. And another example is to remember the relationship between submenus as they fly in and out of the screen. And the thing about low spatial working memory is when we are using our mobile phone, we behave more like people that have low spatial memory. And it comes down because we're more likely to be interrupted when we accomplish our tasks. We have things in the real world competing for attention. Maybe we're walking down the street when we're on our phone, or we're talking to someone. And also we're on our phones and we have other things competing for attention, like our notifications from our other applications. So this idea of low spatial working memory isn't an other person problem. We behave more like people with low spatial ability when we're on our phones. So sequential menus, we're actually a fan of these, but there's a lot of known trade-offs. And we talked about convenience, and what I want to focus is on the intuition. And the intuition isn't a problem with the back button, but it's more about this idea of split buttons, which is a menu button type that all sequential menus use. So what's a split button? Here I have a picture of debut, and sofas is a button. If you click anywhere on sofa, you're going to go to the next step. And this back button is a button, and furniture is a link. And this top item is what's known as a split button. It's a menu item that has two different tasks associated with it. So we're going to dive a bit deeper on split buttons, and we're going to use Venture as a case study. Venture is a large inventory theme again. It's using an accordion menu style, and that's totally fine, even though it's a large inventory, as long as you only have a few sub-menus. And it's using split buttons. I press the plus to open up a menu, and I press the label ski to go to that page. And here is where you have a problem with intuition. In the debut theme, we try to make it clear what's a button by putting a small gray line. It's like only 1 pixel wide. But there's a big difference with that 1 pixel line gives you, is that in the Venture theme, it's not clear where the label begins and ends and the button begins. So you have a high likelihood of someone pressing the ski button and never knowing that there was actually more items underneath. This idea of content being hidden and content loss that Guillaume talked about, it comes down to execution. And so one of the trade-offs with split buttons that we always think about and try to accomplish in our designs is making it more predictable what's happening, and you always have to respect those tap targets we talked about earlier. And before we give our final feeling on split buttons, I think it's interesting to look what other people are saying. And Nielsen Norman Group, in a report titled, "Don't Use Split Buttons for Navigation," they ultimately said not to because people don't understand split buttons. They're not familiar with it. And I think this is a really interesting report because there's some things that Guillaume and I totally agree with, and some things we really got angry when we read, but I'll get into that a bit later. So split buttons, like sequential menus, it comes down to execution. There are ways to make it more convenient. One of the ways to make it less convenient is if you don't make it clear what's possible and you click, for example, ski when you just really wanted to see more menus, and you trigger a whole page refresh. But we still think it's pretty easy to make split buttons look good. But just quickly compare, what are your other options besides split buttons? And one of them is toggle buttons. And this is what we saw in narrative. If I click on catalog, that toggles the submenu. If I click on the arrow, it toggles the submenu. And if I click somewhere in between, it toggles the submenu. And we are huge fans of toggle buttons. Super convenient, there's only one interaction type, it's very intuitive what to do, and as we said, it's easy to make them look good. It's a perfect menu button type. Except the context is important, and we have to recognize that we're building themes for Shopify, and there's this whole other factor we haven't talked about much today, which is the merchant. Everything we're going to talk about today is taken from the customer perspective. When we design themes, we're trying to make things easy for the customer, and we're prioritizing them over the merchant. But a reality is, if you're a menu system, the merchant might have assigned URLs to these higher level items, and in a toggle button menu type, you'll never get to that content, and that's another trade-off. One way to deal with this, that report that I mentioned before, recommends doing something we're doing in Debut. So in Debut, when you click Catalog, it opens the menu, but another click takes you to that page, and the report recommends this is probably a perfectly acceptable alternative, and you should probably prioritize this. We hate this. This is so frustrating. There is no visual indicator here telling you that the second click would do an entirely different action. And again, we talked about interaction cost. When you start triggering a page reload when all you wanted to do was close a menu, is a pretty frustrating experience. And we talked about Nielsen Norman Group, but if we look at the web accessibility initiatives, ARIA is accessible rich internet applications. They recognize that this interaction, this menus type exists, but they recommend strongly against this pattern. So the internet's full of opinions. And when we look at our free themes as a whole, we see that they're using different menu styles, different menu buttons, different interactions trigger different things. And the fact that we have this spread isn't a problem as long as each theme is using a menu style and interaction type that's appropriate for that context. And Guillaume's going to talk, but if you're looking for some guiding principle, something Guillaume and I once said here on stage right now is that users must be able to accomplish the same task on any device, but you don't have to do it necessarily the exact same way, which Guillaume will get into with filtering.
So now that we said that users must be able to accomplish the same task on any device, let's take a closer look at Flagship. The theme is designed to provide advanced filtering options to the customers. And we're all pretty familiar with the standard desktop sidebar where all the actions are regrouped. We wanted to see how other players handles that on mobile. So a few examples in the wild. Macy's, on both devices, they're using an accordion menu, but on mobile, the categories are collapsed by default to gain more space. Canadian Tire, you may not know this brand, but it's probably the most patriotic place to buy snow tires for a Canadian, or hammers. On the mobile version, the filters mirror exactly the desktop layout, which can result in a very long scroll depending on the number of filters. This is supply, one of our themes. The mobile filters are placed on 2 columns. The layout is a bit condensed and overwhelming. And Nathan just told us about sequential menus, and Walmart is using this strategy on mobile, which differs a lot from the desktop experience. An interesting fact, Amazon does exactly the same thing. So let's take a closer look at Amazon, because it must be interesting to see how the largest internet-based retailer does things. So I'm shopping for shoes on my phone, and there's over 300,000 results. So obviously I'm gonna use the filters to narrow down my research. But the result page auto-updates and reloads every time I apply a new filter. So combining multiple filters on my phone creates a lot of back and forth for the user. The interaction cost increases proportionally. There's a few things I really like with Amazon is that they did not try to replicate the desktop layout. So the images are quite big, the tap target seems to be good, they provide an efficient overview of the applied filters, so it's really optimized for mobile, right? Well, not so much. When I read the breadcrumbs, there's no way for me to know exactly where I am. On that device, they truncate after 23 characters. And this missing information is nevertheless available on desktop, so it's not very convenient. And I'm not surprised to see pain points like those one, even with major players like Amazon, but content loss is the #1 failure we want to avoid with Flagship or any other theme. So we identified a few things to keep an eye on during the design phase with Flagship, and while we're here, why don't we beat Amazon at that game? So here's how it goes with Flagship. Large buttons with a good amount of white space. The filter categories are broken down into tabs that are horizontally scrollable. You always see the previously applied filters, and it's easy for you to combine multiple filters on your phone. And you can easily iterate on your search from the result page. It differs a lot from the desktop experience, but all the actions are possible on both devices and optimized for mobile. And like Nathan explained earlier, for us it's not really about designing mobile first, but rather about stepping back from desktop concepts and to approach mobile with fresh eyes. And the focus has to be on the tasks users will have to accomplish on those screens and to make it easy within the constraints of mobile. So if you're asking the question, is Flagship done and ready to be released soon? Actually, no. My part is pretty much done, but it's still just an image for now. So the theme is now being built by Nathan's team, so it's their problem to figure things out now. And something else will have to be considered during the build phase, which is speed.
So our focus today is on the user experience for small screens, and speed has a huge impact on that user experience. And when I talk about the realities of mobile, I really should add one more, which is what we refer to as variable performance. The strength and speed of a user's internet connection is going to change throughout the day. It's going to change based on their environment. And when I hear people talk about this and web developers talk about this, it's this kind of understood concept, but it's always presented as this problem that other people have to deal with in like other places of the world that never really get named. So I'd like to ask people if they've ever been in any of these exotic locations. The first of being outside. So really common music festivals or cities with high congestion, you have a lot of people competing with the same closest cell tower for that connection speed, and it really clogs it down. Another thing is cafes. Your favorite cafe might have a regrettably lousy internet connection. Another one is we have Christmas coming up, and maybe some of you can go visit your parents out in the boons. How good's their internet connection? And finally, you might just have no internet connection. Guillaume and I are both from Montreal, and any Montrealese worth their salt knows exactly which metro stops you suddenly get zero internet. So this isn't a problem that for other people. When we build our sites, we have to keep this in mind, because it's so easy to go from this situation to your provider, which is mine, Fido, on their extended network connection. And a report put out by DoubleClick, which is a Google-owned company, is they say that about 53% of mobile visits are abandoned after the first 3 seconds. The same report and other reports have said that about half of all internet users expect a website to load on mobile within 2 seconds. So this is a screenshot from a presentation I attended in Toronto, and the presentation is called The Hateful Wait. And in it, he identified that the biggest bottleneck for page rendering is images. So how would we tackle that? We've done it in narrative with this concept of responsive images. And for those unfamiliar, it's about loading the appropriate size image based on its intended display. And you can see here in a side-by-side comparison of the demo store's mobile and desktop version, the mobile picture is 1/7 the size. And I won't get into details about how to implement responsive images, but if you're curious, we have a blog post out called Using Responsive Images to Decrease Load Times. It was written by Liam Griffin at Shopify. And doing a side-by-side comparison, simulating a 3G network, and I showed this at Unite, so you might be familiar. The image on the right is using responsive image strategy on a weak connection, and it can load within 5.5 seconds, when previous to that, it took like a lot longer, about over 13 seconds. And when we looked at all of our demo stores, for example, when we made this update, we saw about a 50% decrease in page render time for all these different demo stores with their different content, and a decrease in the initial page weight of 85%. And the reason that's so high isn't just because the images are smaller, it's because now we're implementing something called lazy loading, is where we're only going to load the images as they scroll up into the viewport. There's no reason to load an image that someone's never going to see. And when we talk about performance, really what's important is perceived performance. It doesn't matter about what type of technical wizardry you have going on in the back end. What only matters is what the person thinks is going on and what they feel is going on that determines their experience. So when we load a normal website, this is what we see. Nothing gets shown on the page until the HTML document and the linked style sheets get downloaded. But with narrative, what we implemented was the idea of critical styles. So a lot quicker, we tried to show someone something. And so on the home page, what you see very quickly is that there's going to be some content that takes up most of the screen, and there's going to be some buttons up top. On an internal page, like a product page, I'm not sure if it comes through in the contrast, but there's a clear white bar up top saying there's going to be some sort of header. And how we do this with critical styles is we inline only the styles that we feel are critical, that are necessary for initial page render, and then we download the main style sheet asynchronously via JavaScript. And if you want to know more about that and other things we've done in narrative to make it one of our fastest themes, Thomas Kelly, who was the lead developer for narrative, put out a blog post a while ago called Crafting Faster Themes. And so in conclusion, a lot about design for small screens is about trade-offs. User experience is always about trade-offs. Different menu styles, as we talked about, and interactions and techniques all come with their own wins and compromises. And ultimately, it's the context that's going to decide, and context is composed of many elements. What type of merchant you have, what their information architecture looks like, their inventory size, and the screen size you're on. And we've always been talking about the customer experience, and we're prioritizing that over the merchant experience. And all of this is another way of saying it depends, which is like the most frustrating answer to any question. So Guillaume and I want to leave you with kind of 3, we'll say, hard and fast rules. One of it is just things will look differently and behave differently on different size screens. All of your fingers are fat, so your design should reflect that. And finally, you should be developing with performance in mind, because it's so easy to transition to a much weaker connection. Everything we presented today is actually the cumulative knowledge of everyone who works on the themes team, so our designers, our data specialists, and numerous front-end developers. So it's unfair that Guillaume and I get to come here and take credit, so we just want to pay tribute to all of that. And we'll also be having office hours later today if you want to come talk to us then, but we're already 5 minutes over time. So thank you.